Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another story from the roads less traveled. My name is David, and for the past 15 years, I've been running a small guest house here on Ko Samui. Over the years, I've met countless souls seeking something different, something real, something that their old lives couldn't provide. But today, I want to share with you the story of one particular guest, a man who became not just a customer, but a dear friend. His name was Thomas Gallagher, and what happened to him here on this beautiful island will haunt me forever. This is a story about trust, about love, and about how sometimes the very thing we're searching for can become the trap that destroys us. The call came at 3 in the morning. My phone buzzed against the wooden nightstand, cutting through the gentle sounds of the tropical night like a scream. Thomas Gallagher was sobbing on the other end, his voice barely recognizable through the tears and panic. "David," he whispered. "She's gone. Everything's gone. My pension, my savings, my house back home. I'm sitting here in this empty apartment, and I don't even know how I got here." I had known this day might come. I had seen the warning signs, felt the growing unease every time I watched them together. But hearing Thomas break down like this, hearing a 62-year-old man who had survived a military career and a bitter divorce reduced to nothing more than desperate sobs, that was something I'll never forget. The woman he had trusted with his heart, his future, and ultimately his entire life had vanished into the Thai night, taking with her not just his money, but his dignity, his hope, and his will to continue living. Before I continue with Thomas's story, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel. The stories I share here are real, they're raw, and they need to be heard. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of travelers who believe that every story, no matter how painful, deserves to be told. Thomas Gallagher arrived at my guest house on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying nothing but a worn leather suitcase and the kind of weariness that comes from a life lived too hard for too long. He was 62 years old, a retired sergeant from the British Army who had spent 34 years serving his country in places most people couldn't pronounce. His face was weathered, carved by decades of responsibility and disappointment, but his eyes still held that spark of curiosity that draws men to foreign shores. He had just finalized a divorce that had lasted 3 brutal years, a marriage that had slowly suffocated under the weight of military deployments, financial stress, and 2 people who had simply grown into strangers sharing the same bed. The settlement had left him with half of everything, which in his case meant a modest pension, some savings, and the crushing realization that at 62 he was starting over completely. His ex-wife had kept the house in Manchester, the one they had bought together 30 years earlier with dreams of growing old on that quiet street. His 2 children, both adults now, had chosen sides during the divorce, and Thomas had lost that battle too. He came to Ko Samui not because he had always dreamed of tropical beaches, but because it was far enough away from everything he had lost, and cheap enough that his pension might actually mean something. I remember the first conversation we had on the terrace that overlooks the Gulf. He sat there with a bottle of Chang beer watching the sunset over the water, and he told me about the silence that had consumed his life. "You know what the worst part about divorce is, David?" he said, his voice carrying that particular weight of a man who has been carrying secrets for too long. "It's not the fighting, it's not even the lawyers. It's the silence that comes after. You wake up in a bed that's too big, in a house that echoes, and you realize that you've spent so much time being angry that you forgot how to be anything else." He had come to Thailand to find peace, maybe even happiness, but mostly just to remember what it felt like to be alive again. The money situation wasn't desperate, but it wasn't comfortable either. His military pension provided about £1,800 a month, and he had managed to save roughly £40,000 from the divorce settlement. In Ko Samui, this could last him several years if he was careful, maybe even the rest of his life if he was smart about it. He rented a small apartment near the beach, nothing fancy but clean and quiet. He established a routine walking to the market each morning, swimming in the afternoon, and spending his evenings reading on the terrace or chatting with other expats at the local bars. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something approaching contentment. That was when Kanya walked into his life, and everything changed. She appeared on a Thursday evening at the beach bar, the kind of place where expats gather to complain about the weather back home and pretend they're living the dream. Kanya was 28 years old, beautiful in that effortless way that seems to come naturally to Thai women, with long black hair that caught the light and eyes that seemed to see everything. She worked as a translator for a local tour company, spoke perfect English with just enough of an accent to be charming, and had the kind of smile that made men forget their age, their circumstances, and their common sense. Thomas was sitting alone at the bar, nursing his second beer and reading a paperback thriller when she approached him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but confident, "but are you the gentleman staying at David's guest house? I think I saw you at the market yesterday." It was a simple opening, innocent enough, but there was something in her manner, something in the way she looked at him, that made Thomas feel like he was 20 years younger and 20 times more interesting than he actually was. They talked for 2 hours that first night. Kanya told him about her life, how she had grown up in a small village near Chiang Mai, how she had worked her way through university, how she dreamed of traveling the world but felt trapped by family obligations. Her father had died 2 years earlier, she explained, and her mother needed expensive medical treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. She was supporting not just her mother, but also her younger brother who was studying in Bangkok. Thomas found himself drawn not just to her beauty, but to her apparent strength, her determination to build something better for herself and her family. "You know what I like about you, Thomas?" she said as the evening wound down, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You're not like the other foreign men who come here. You listen. You actually care about what I'm saying." Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, something he had almost forgotten existed. He felt wanted, needed, important. When Kanya asked if she could see him again, Thomas didn't hesitate to say yes. The courtship moved with the kind of intensity that should have been a warning sign. Within 2 weeks, they were spending every day together. Kanya would finish work and come straight to Thomas's apartment, where they would cook dinner together, watch movies on his laptop, and talk late into the night about their dreams, their fears, their pasts. She was fascinated by his military stories, impressed by his experiences, and sympathetic about his divorce. "Your wife was a fool to let you go," she would whisper as they lay together in the humid darkness. "She didn't deserve a man like you." But even as Thomas basked in this newfound happiness, there were moments that made him pause. Sometimes he would catch Kanya checking her phone with an urgency that seemed out of place, her fingers flying across the screen as she typed messages in Thai. When he asked who she was texting, she would smile and say it was just work, just her mother, just her brother who needed money for university. There were occasions when she would disappear for hours without explanation, returning with vague stories about family emergencies or work obligations that never quite added up. The first real red flag came during their 3rd week together. They were walking through the night market when Kanya suddenly stopped in front of a jewelry stall, her eyes fixed on a gold necklace that probably cost more than Thomas spent on food in a month. "It's beautiful," she murmured, and something in her voice, something wistful and longing, made Thomas want to buy it for her immediately. He didn't, not that night, but the seed was planted. A few days later, he surprised her with the necklace, and the joy on her face, the way she threw her arms around him and whispered, "I love you," for the first time, made him feel like the most generous man in the world. That night, as they made love with a passion that Thomas hadn't felt in decades, he thought he had found something real, something worth fighting for. He had no idea that he had just taken the first step into a carefully constructed trap that would cost him everything he had left. The request started small, almost insignificant. Kanya's mother needed medicine. Could Thomas help with a few $100s? Her brother's university fees were due, and the family was short just a little bit, maybe 500 pounds. Her scooter had broken down, and without it she couldn't get to work. Could Thomas help her get it fixed? Each request came with tears, with apologies, with promises that she would pay him back as soon as she could. And each time Thomas found himself saying yes, not because he believed the stories were entirely true, but because saying no felt like admitting that what they had wasn't real. Thomas told himself he was being smart about it. He never gave her cash directly, always paying the mechanic, the hospital, the university himself. He kept records of every transaction, thinking of them as loans that would eventually be repaid. But the requests grew larger and more frequent. Kanya's mother needed surgery, 5,000 pounds. The family was losing their land unless they could come up with 10,000 pounds immediately. Her brother had been offered a scholarship to study in America, but needed 15,000 pounds for expenses. Each crisis was presented with such emotional intensity, with such apparent desperation, that Thomas found himself emptying his savings account piece by piece. The psychological manipulation was subtle but devastating. Kanya had a gift for making Thomas feel like her hero, her savior, the only person in the world who truly understood her. After each financial request, she would become more loving, more affectionate, more physically intimate than ever before. She talked constantly about their future together, about the house they would buy, the children they might adopt, the business they could start. She painted pictures of a life so perfect, so full of love and purpose, that Thomas convinced himself every sacrifice was worth it. But there were also moments of withdrawal, times when Kanya would become distant and cold, especially if Thomas hesitated before agreeing to help with money. She would accuse him of not trusting her, of not loving her enough, of being selfish and suspicious like all Western men. These emotional punishments were followed by periods of intense reconciliation, where Kanya would apologize through tears, explain how much stress she was under, how much pressure her family was putting on her, how Thomas was the only stability in her chaotic life. 6 months into their relationship, Thomas had given Kanya nearly 30,000 pounds, more than 3/4 of his life savings. His pension barely covered his basic living expenses, and he had started using credit cards to maintain the lifestyle that Kanya had grown accustomed to. They ate at expensive restaurants, took weekend trips to Bangkok, stayed in hotels that cost more per night than Thomas used to spend in a week. But he justified every expense because Kanya made him feel alive, made him feel like he mattered, made him feel like he was living the kind of adventure that had been missing from his structured military life. The trap closed slowly, so gradually that Thomas didn't realize how completely he had been ensnared until it was far too late. By the time he understood what was happening, he had already signed documents he couldn't read, transferred ownership of assets he barely remembered having, and committed himself to financial obligations that would follow him for the rest of his life. Before I continue with what happened next, I want to pause and ask you something. Have you ever known someone who fell into a situation like this? Maybe it wasn't a romance scam, but perhaps a friend or family member who got caught up in something that seemed too good to be true. Leave a comment below and share your story. And please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because Thomas's story is about to take a turn that will shock you, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The beginning of the end came on a Tuesday morning in September, almost exactly 6 months after Thomas had first met Kanya. She arrived at his apartment in tears, clutching her phone and speaking rapidly in Thai to someone on the other end. When she hung up, she turned to Thomas with a look of desperation that he had never seen before. "Baby," she said, her voice breaking, "my family is in serious trouble. The police came to our house last night. They say my brother owes money to the wrong people, gambling debts. If we don't pay 50,000 pounds by the end of the week, they're going to hurt my mother." Thomas felt his blood turn cold. 50,000 pounds was more money than he had, more than he could possibly get his hands on. But Kanya was already moving, pacing around the small apartment, talking about solutions, about options, about ways they could save her family. "Your pension," she said suddenly, stopping in front of him. "You get 1,800 pounds every month for the rest of your life, right? That's worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. We can use it as collateral, get a loan, solve this problem, and then pay it back slowly." What happened next was a blur of documents, translations, legal offices, and signatures. Kanya had already researched the process, already found a financial company that specialized in pension advances for expats. She had forms ready, translators standing by, and a sense of urgency that made it impossible for Thomas to slow down and think clearly. Within 3 days, Thomas had signed over his entire military pension to a Thai financial company in exchange for a lump sum of £60,000. The fine print, written in Thai legal language that Thomas couldn't understand despite the rushed translation, essentially gave the company the right to his pension payments for the next 15 years. But even £60,000 wasn't enough. Kanya's family crisis kept growing, kept requiring more money, more documentation, more signatures. Before Thomas fully understood what was happening, he had also signed over the title to his apartment lease, listed Kanya as the beneficiary on his UK bank accounts, and taken out personal loans using his pension advance as collateral. In the space of one terrifying week, Thomas had committed every penny he had or would ever have to saving a family he had never met from a crisis he couldn't verify. The money disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Kanya would leave the apartment with thick envelopes of cash, returning hours later with reports that they had solved one problem but discovered another. The police needed to be paid off. The gambling bosses wanted interest on top of the original debt. Her brother needed to disappear for a while, which required more money for his safe passage to another province. Each day brought new revelations, new complications, new reasons why they needed just a little bit more to make everything right. Thomas tried to stay calm, tried to maintain faith in the woman he loved, but doubt was creeping in like water through a cracked foundation. He started asking harder questions, demanding to meet Kanya's family, insisting on seeing documentation for these emergencies that seemed to multiply every day. But Kanya had an answer for everything. It wasn't safe for him to meet her family while they were in hiding. The documents were with the lawyers who were trying to sort out the legal problems. Everything had to be kept secret until the crisis was resolved because the wrong people had connections everywhere. Then came the morning when Thomas woke up and Kanya was gone. Not just out running errands, but completely gone. Her clothes were missing from the closet, her toiletries vanished from the bathroom, her jewelry absent from the small box where she kept it on his dresser. The apartment felt hollow, echoing as empty as Thomas's heart. On the kitchen table was a handwritten note in English. "Thomas, I had to go. Family emergency got worse. Will contact you soon. Love always, Kanya." But the note was a lie, and deep down, Thomas knew it. Days passed with no contact. Her phone number was disconnected. The tour company where she supposedly worked had never heard of anyone named Kanya. The apartment where she claimed to live turned out to be vacant, had been vacant for months according to the neighbors. Slowly, horribly, Thomas began to understand that everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved was a carefully constructed fiction. The financial devastation became clear over the following weeks as Thomas tried to untangle what had been done to his life. The pension advance company had his signature on legally binding documents that gave them the right to his military pension for the next 15 years. The personal loans he had co-signed were in default because the money had vanished, and the lenders were demanding immediate repayment with interest and penalties that Thomas couldn't afford. His UK bank accounts had been systematically drained through a power of attorney that he had signed without fully understanding its implications. Worst of all, the apartment lease that he had signed over to Kanya was also a trap. The original rental agreement had been modified to include massive penalty clauses for early termination, and the lease was now in Kanya's name with Thomas listed as the financially responsible party. When she disappeared, the landlord came after Thomas for months of back rent that Kanya had never actually paid, plus penalties and damages that amounted to more than £20,000. In less than a week, Thomas Gallagher had gone from being a man with a modest but secure retirement to being completely broke and drowning in debt that would follow him for the rest of his life. His pension was gone, his savings were gone, and he was now legally responsible for financial obligations that were larger than anything he could ever hope to repay. At 62 years old, Thomas faced the choice between declaring bankruptcy and destroying what remained of his credit, or trying to work for the rest of his life to pay off debts that had been created through lies and manipulation. But the financial devastation was nothing compared to the emotional destruction that Kanya had left behind. Thomas had believed that he had found love again, that someone truly cared about him, that his life still had meaning and purpose. The realization that everything had been an elaborate deception, that every kiss had been calculated, every "I love you" a manipulation, every moment of intimacy a performance designed to separate him from his money, left Thomas feeling like his entire sense of reality had been shattered. The worst part was the self-blame, the constant mental replay of all the warning signs he had ignored, all the moments when his instincts had told him something was wrong, but he had chosen to believe in the fairy tale instead. Thomas spent sleepless nights going over every conversation, every gesture, every moment of their relationship, trying to figure out how much of it had been real and how much had been an act. The conclusion he reached was devastating. None of it had been real. He had been nothing more than a mark, a target, a source of income for a woman who had probably done this before and would certainly do it again. The isolation was crushing. Thomas couldn't bring himself to contact his children, couldn't bear to admit that the new life he had bragged about in their occasional emails had been a complete illusion. He couldn't face the other expats at the bars and restaurants where he and Kanya had spent so many evenings, couldn't stand the thought of their pity or their judgment. He stopped leaving his apartment except when absolutely necessary, surviving on instant noodles and cheap beer, spending his days staring at the ceiling and wondering how a man who had survived military combat and personal tragedy could have been so completely fooled by a woman half his age. The turning point came on a night in October when Thomas called me at 3 a.m, drunk and desperate, talking about how maybe it would be better if he just walked into the ocean and never came back. I threw on clothes and drove to his apartment, where I found him sitting on the floor with an empty bottle of whiskey and a folder full of legal documents that he couldn't understand but knew meant he was financially ruined. "She got everything, David," he kept repeating. "My pension, my savings, my future. I'm 62 years old and I have nothing left. I gave her everything because I thought she loved me, and now I'm going to die broken alone." That night marked the beginning of Thomas's long journey back from the edge of complete destruction. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but slowly, with help from friends like me and a few other expats who had seen similar situations, Thomas began to fight back. He hired a Thai lawyer who specialized in fraud cases, someone who could read the documents Thomas had signed and look for ways to challenge them. He contacted his bank in the UK and reported the unauthorized transactions, filing complaints with every financial authority he could find. The legal battle was exhausting and expensive, but Thomas discovered that he wasn't Kanya's first victim. The lawyer found evidence of at least 4 other Western men who had been scammed by the same woman using variations of the same story. The pension advance company had a history of predatory lending practices, and several of the documents Thomas had signed contained clauses that were actually illegal under Thai law. It took nearly 2 years, but eventually Thomas was able to recover about half of what he had lost, including getting his pension payments restored, though with reduced amounts due to the legal fees and penalties he had to pay. More importantly, Thomas began to understand that what had happened to him wasn't his fault, at least not entirely. He had been targeted by professionals, people who made their living identifying vulnerable, lonely men and exploiting their need for connection and love. The psychological manipulation he had experienced was sophisticated and deliberate, designed to bypass rational thinking and appeal directly to emotional needs that he hadn't even realized he had. The recovery process wasn't just about money. It was about rebuilding a sense of self-worth and learning to trust his own judgment again. Thomas started seeing a counselor who specialized in fraud victims, joining support groups for people who had been scammed, and slowly reconnecting with the world around him. He began volunteering at a local charity that helped other expats navigate legal and financial problems, finding purpose in using his painful experience to help others avoid similar traps. Thomas also had to confront some hard truths about himself and the choices he had made. He realized that his vulnerability to Kanya's manipulation hadn't just been about loneliness, but about his own ego, his desire to feel young and desirable and important again. He had wanted to believe that a beautiful young woman could truly love him, not because of what he could provide, but because of who he was, and that desire had made him ignore obvious warning signs and rationalize increasingly suspicious behavior. The financial situation remained challenging, but Thomas learned to live more modestly and found peace and simplicity. His reduced pension was enough to cover basic living expenses in Thailand, and the small amount he had recovered from the legal battle gave him a modest emergency fund. He moved to a cheaper apartment, learned to cook Thai food, and discovered that happiness didn't require the expensive lifestyle that he had been maintaining with Kanya. Most importantly, Thomas learned to value genuine friendships over romantic relationships. He built strong connections with other expats who had faced similar challenges, creating a support network of people who understood the complexities of starting over in a foreign country. He learned to spot the warning signs of scams and manipulation, and he began sharing his story with other vulnerable men, helping them avoid the kind of trap that had destroyed his financial security. Thomas Gallagher is 74 years old now, and he still lives in Ko Samui. His apartment is small and simple, but it's his and nobody can take it away from him. He has enough money to live modestly but comfortably, and more importantly, he has genuine friendships with people who care about him as a person, not as a source of income. He volunteers at the local animal shelter, teaches English to Thai children, and has found a sense of purpose that has nothing to do with romance or the need to be needed by someone else. When I asked Thomas recently what he had learned from his experience with Kanya, he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I learned that love isn't something you can buy, David, no matter how much money you spend or how generous you try to be. Real love is built on honesty, on shared experiences, on mutual respect. What I had with Kanya wasn't love, it was a transaction. I was paying for the illusion of being loved, and she was very good at maintaining that illusion as long as the payments kept coming." Thomas's story is a warning, but it's also a story of redemption. It's about how even the most devastating betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story, how it's possible to rebuild after losing everything, and how sometimes the worst thing that happens to us can become the foundation for wisdom and genuine happiness. Thomas lost his pension, his savings, and his faith in romantic love, but he gained something more valuable. He learned who he really was when everything else was stripped away, and he discovered that he was stronger than he had ever imagined. The lessons from Thomas's experience extend far beyond romance scams or financial fraud. His story is about the universal human need for connection and validation, and how that need can be exploited by people who understand psychology better than their victims understand themselves. It's about the importance of maintaining independence even in intimate relationships, about the difference between love and dependency, and about the courage it takes to admit when something that feels wonderful is actually destroying your life. For anyone watching this who recognizes elements of their own situation in Thomas's story, please know that you're not alone, and it's never too late to get help. Whether it's a romantic scam, a financial fraud, or any other situation where you feel like you're losing control of your life, there are people who understand what you're going through and resources available to help you find your way back. The shame and embarrassment that keep people trapped in these situations are part of the trap itself, but there's no shame in being human, in wanting to be loved, in hoping for something better. Thomas wanted me to end his story with a message for anyone who might be facing similar circumstances. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be ashamed to admit that you've made mistakes, and don't ever believe that it's too late to start over. I thought my life was finished at 62, but some of my best years have come after I lost everything. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what really matters. And what really matters isn't money or romance or the approval of others. What matters is being true to yourself, building genuine relationships with people who care about you, and finding ways to make a positive difference in the world around you. If Thomas's story has resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and share it with others who might benefit from hearing it. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, your own experiences, or just letting us know that you were moved by Thomas's journey from devastation to redemption. And keep watching, because there are more stories to tell, more lessons to share, and more proof that no matter how dark things get, there's always hope for a better tomorrow. Thank you for listening, and